Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to our continuation of Introduction to Philosophy. In our first lecture, we gave an overview of philosophy, which is the love of wisdom. And we got right about what we mean by love and wisdom. We also provided an initial sense of philosophy in relation to other disciplines or other sciences. But philosophy is a fundamental science, and its relation to the other sciences, among other things, is that it curbs reductionistic tendencies in those sciences. It offers correctives, right, to keep the other sciences from presuming themselves to be the sole form of knowledge. So philosophers are lovers of wisdom. That is to say, philosophers love wisdom. They have a fondness, a dearness, uh, uh, and a choosing of their will for it. And they love in this way like one would love a best friend. And what do they love? They love wisdom. Right? Wisdom is the highest kind of knowledge. It is knowledge of the highest and deepest causes of things through the highest and deepest causes of things. And this knowledge passes into the affect, that is the mover of our will. Wisdom is also dispositional. It's an intellectual virtue, right? And so, through an apprehension uh, of wisdom in sense experience as it relates to perception and imagination, philosophers reason their way to a judgment of the intellect. And this judgment of the intellect is a judgment bestowing wisdom. And so, what distinguishes philosophers from the figures of technical science, uh, and what distinguishes philosophers from the wise, that is, those who are said to have wisdom, is that on one hand, philosophers see something beyond technical science. And on the other hand, philosophers are more keen on utilizing the tools of technical science to arrive at a comprehensive wisdom of not just the affect, but also of the intellect. Now, in this lecture, we're going to, I think, acquire a less vague sense of philosophy by looking at its origins, and by looking at what the early philosophers were trying to do. And what they were trying to do, these early philosophers, was the work of a kind of metaphysics that we call cosmology. They were trying to find something, right, to account for one, change, and two, unity and difference, or that is the one and the many. Let's begin by making sense of the origins of philosophy. Now, we say the origins of the perennial philosophy. I'll explain what that is, but to kind of put it simply at the moment, the origins of philosophy. Now, it's important to begin with origins, uh, because even though we're 2,500 plus years away from the origination of philosophy, still the beginning contains the end latent in itself. And inversely, we can say that the end has something of the beginning in it. Generally, though, we understand something by accounting or finding or discovering the origin of that thing. Where does that thing originate from? Now, we need not be committed to the idea that all things that proceed from an origin just revert back to the origin. Uh, but nevertheless, we have to be committed to at least some uh, uh, appreciation or recognition that the origin of a thing provides a sort of intelligible light upon what follows from it. So, with that in mind, let's consider the origin of philosophy. Philosophy did not always have the independent existence it does now. In the far ancient world, so we're speaking 28, 29, 3,000 years ago, philosophy flowed from religion and remained a byproduct of religious systems. But a change occurred around 600 BC that reoriented humankind away from survival and worldly prosperity and instead focused their attention on the heavenly realm of eternal things. This fundamental shift in human experience around this time has been labeled the axial age. Basically, what it means is that humans underwent a change to a new set of values centered more on the realization of ultimate realities than on purely temporal concerns, like survival, for instance. Jacobs, who is the author of a great primer on philosophy, notes that a few happenings were occurring around this time that lent themselves to a sort of global awakening. For one, there were significant developments within Judaism that testified to a need to revivify Jewish spiritual life. With the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 and the subsequent exile to Babylon, the Israelites underwent a series of prophetic awakenings. Prophets such as Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and others, all of whom were living around the 600s BC, helped usher in the rebuilding of the temple in 515 BC and the subsequent revivification of Jewish life under Ezra and Nehemiah. Around the same time in China, Lao Tzu would write the work that became the foundation for Taoism. And not long after, Confucius established the classical Chinese school of philosophy that would shape Chinese culture for millennia to come, even up to this day. In the same breadth of time, Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha, there are many Buddhas in Buddhism, but he's sort of the definitive one, was fostering insights from the Vedanta school, that is the Hindu school of philosophy, to reach his own insights into attaining enlightenment. And Zoroaster was originating the religion that was to be the official faith of the Persian Empire, so like modern day Iran, which is many people in Iran are still practice Zoroastrianism. But it was in Greece, first with the pre-Socratics and later with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, that the awakening to the transcendent aspects of the universe would take a different form and set Western civilization on a path different from the other great cultures of the ancient world. The pre-Socratics, who were the figures of this turn to the transcendent aspects of the universe, sought a primary and ultimate element, idea, or being of all things. And so what we now know as philosophy began with what we call the pre-Socratics of the Ionian Peninsula, who spoke the Ionian dialect. And the first of these figures, the great sage of the pre-Socratics, is Thales of Miletus. There appeared to the first philosophers, these pre-Socratics who were Ionian, many different things in the world, and yet these things seem to somehow belong to the same thing. For instance, There is ice, water, and vapor, but these states of matter, as we now call them, still seemed unified in origin to one thing. In other words, despite the apparent differences of these states of matter, there still seemed to be a unity behind the difference. So the curiosity of the first philosophers, the pre-Socratics, centered on a question or problem concerning unity and difference, the one and the many, as well as changelessness and changingness. So the question that needed to be answered if the world was to make sense for the pre-Socratics is this: what is the stable principle behind all things? The early Greek philosophers, with their sense of reality and power of abstraction, enabled them at a very early date to recognize their religious ideas for what they actually were, creations of an artistic imagination. But the answer to the question of what is the stable principle behind all things cannot be the religious answer of the time. So this is what distinguishes the pre-Socratics from the other religious systems. The pre-Socratics realized that an answer to this question cannot merely be a byproduct of the religious system. Why not? Well, because the gods themselves cannot be the stable principle behind change. Because the gods, simply put, are quite unstable. They are capricious. They are given to fluctuations in their passions. So to say that Apollo or any of the gods regulates the natural course of things makes about as much sense as to say that the regular movements of humans are determined by the arbitrary decrees of a king. One could say some of our actions are regulated by a legislator, but not all. And so while the gods might have some influence upon the natural course of things, the very reason for their regularity cannot be attributed entirely to the capricious gods. So the pre-Socratics, not being the sort of cynics of religion that maybe we think someone that moves away from a religious explanation would be, the pre-Socratics, not being that, realized that perhaps by employing the use of our reason and our sense experience, we can find this stable principle. Right? And perhaps it just might agree with the religious system that's already in place. Now, we have a sense of the origin of philosophy. The origin of philosophy had to do, and still has to do, with providing a rational explanation of proceeding on the basis of reason to account for things that we take for granted. Right? And this hasn't really gone away. New myths are formed, new myths are given, whatever that myth may be. That could be the myth of a religion. It could be the superstition of a culture. Uh, there's a philosopher named Lou Marinoff who decries the what he calls the New Age superstition, which is a superstition about words and the meaning of words. Right? So that a rational explanation that isn't beholden just to empirical science, as we've talked about before, right? But that which has its own myth, by the way, but also just isn't beholden to some religious myth, but seeks a rational explanation. This occurring across all societies and cultures at one point or another forms one aspect of what we refer to as the perennial philosophy, which is a term in the history of philosophy for denoting an open system of discursive reason across the ages. Now, I say one aspect because this whole let's proceed on the basis of reason and let's not be so beholden to myths of a particular time or society. Um, I say one aspect because there's another aspect to it, right? which has to do with a tradition or what is handed down. It also has to do with uh, what I like to call philosophical resurgence. So here's an analogy from biology. Uh, you've maybe heard of perennial plants. Some plants are labeled as perennial or as annual or whatever. But basically, perennial plants recommence their growth at applicable times or seasons. They may be dormant for a period of time, but they spring back, right? As long as they're not pulled up out of the earth, right? They endure in this way. They endure, perdure. Or, if some natural disaster doesn't uproot them and corrupt them in some way. So to be perennial is to, in short, continue on, to perdure, right? And so the perennial philosophy, Philosophia Perennis, refers to an ongoing philosophical inquiry across history and to a resurgence of what flows from this inquiry and to a refounding of the prior blossoms of philosophical discovery. So if you take on one hand this perennial philosophy as a open system of discursive reason, and you take it alongside this other sense of philosophy as um, kind of reappearing throughout time, right? You get the perennial philosophy. Right? And it doesn't matter so much whether one agrees with everything a philosopher says. Still, the perennial philosophy as a tradition recognizes that even a philosopher that doesn't get everything right has very important insights that are needed for the pursuit of truth. I don't like everything the 19th, early 20th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche says, but there's a lot in Nietzsche that is very important for the pursuit of truth. Well, now, the initial founding or the birthplace of this philosophy was in Asia Minor, and its midwives. So now we've got a birth analogy, which Socrates loved. Its midwives were the early Greeks, the Ionians, and we call them the pre-Socratics. So the we can think then of the pre-Socratics as the gardeners, the one kind of first planting this. And we may also think of them as the midwives, the ones bringing out this philosophical child, right, um, through the labor of their intellect. That is an image of Socrates there. We will get into Socrates in our next lecture. But we call these Ionians pre-Socratics, right, in a way to honor, the greatness of Socrates. So the pre-Socratics, pre meaning coming before, prior to, the pre-Socratics were prior to the Socratics, and there are three that occupy most of our focus: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. There's one more thing I want to say about the perennial philosophy that I was just reading about yesterday, that is, and it's that there are so many interesting ways of thinking about these sort of organic analogies and surprising examples, coincidences of this occurring in time. So one of the figures that really represents the cultivation of perennial philosophy is Saint Augustine of Hippo, who was a Christian philosopher. He was a Manichaean for a while, but a Christian philosopher and theologian, um, who is accredited with uh, forging um, uh, a harmony. Let's put it that way for the time being. A harmony, perhaps a fundamental unity. I'm not exactly sure, but a harmony between um, Platonic philosophy, early, middle, and late, or Neoplatonic philosophy, with Christian revelation, right? And Augustine represents as well, a kind of transition from ancient to medieval philosophy. Well, it's interesting to know that um, Father Gregor Mendel, who we call the father of genetics, he was an Augustinian priest. And Mendel, in sort of occupying these two worlds of empirical science and um, the priestly office, he represents a not a Darwinian evolution. The the Darwinian evolutionists opposed him, but a kind of developmentalism, right? And so what you find in, say, a figure like Gregor Mendel is the perennial philosophy as being compatible with a form of genetic variation, right? That isn't beholden to the myth of Darwinian evolution, right? But still accords with this sense of diversity of thought in the perennial philosophy, right? So that's just an interesting little factoid for you. As we said, the origin of the perennial philosophy is Ionia. So this is a modern map. So this shows modern Turkey and the modern national states and boundaries uh, presently, right? But if you were to go back in time and you were to look for the location of Ionia Miletus, which is where Thales is from, it would be here, the western coast of modern day Turkey. So not in Greece, right? But in the Mediterranean, at a very important, say, port place in the ancient world. So that begins our foray into the first figure of the pre-Socratics, the great sage Thales. Copleston, who I will refer to many times throughout this presentation because he is the eminent historian of philosophy. He says that the mixture of philosopher and practical scientist is seen very clearly in the case of Thales of Miletus. He's believed to have accurately predicted the eclipse of the sun in 585. That's the practical scientist side of him. But also, uh, on the philosophical side of him, there's a report by Diogenes, um, uh, which is a kind of anecdote that Thales fell into a well while he was stargazing. So he was looking up at the heavens and was so absent-minded, the stereotype of the absent-minded philosopher, and fell into a well. Got so caught up in thought, he got one-shotted by a well. There are other scientific activities that are attributed to him. One is that he constructed an almanac and introduced the Phoenician practice of steering a ship's course by the little bear, so constellation. But the most important um, uh, doctrine from a speculative cosmological philosophical um, vantage is that Thales declared the primary stuff of all things to be water. Now remember, these early cosmologists were looking for a primary element, ultimate element, um, to account for all things, including change, as well as to account for unity and diversity. Aristotle, and we'll talk more about the philosopher in our second lecture, conjectures that observation may have led, so since observation may have led Thales to this conclusion, getting the notion perhaps from seeing that the nutriment of all things is moist and that heat itself is generated from the moist and kept alive by it. And he got this notion from this fact, and from the fact that the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is the origin of the nature of moist things. And Thales and Aristotle also says, um, may have been influenced by older theologies. But the importance of this early thinker with the other pre-Socratics lies in the fact that he raised a question of what is the ultimate nature of the world. It's not in that he actually gave to that question, or in his reasons be what they may be. Um, I'm sorry, it is not in the answer that he actually gave to that question that matters, um, but that he accounted for something. And to be fair, um, Thales didn't account for the ultimate um, f- uh, fundamentum of the universe. However, it's it's arguable, but I think it's uh, a, an apt conclusion that what he did answer or provide uh, was the appearance of change. That in some way he accounted for the appearance of change, even though his discovery was not truly fundamental. So we might ask, well, how does water account for the appearance of change? Uh, well, on one hand, it appears to be everywhere. It's vital for life. That's uh, more of a kind of tertiary consideration for that. But it's mainly in this that water has a constant and fluid motion, right? And it occurs in various phases or states of matter. In fact, it would seem to me that um, hydrophysics, right, does seem to evince this point that water accounts for the appearance of change, even in the sense that if you were to put water constant in a constantly flowing state, it would have an appearance of motionless. So it kind of motionlessness. So it sort of touches upon um, uh, 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 a a form of motion by appearance, right? That goes beyond the uh, the more um, obvious appearance of motion. So it gets a little bit behind one kind of appearance of uh, change and motion, but yet it's not truly fundamental for various reasons, for obvious reasons actually, that we'll get into in our next philosopher, our next pre-Socratic, Anaximander. For Anaximander, of course, water um, can't be the thing that accounts for change because it doesn't have the properties that can unify the other elements, the other basic elements. For Anaximander, of course, he was still looking for primitive matter to explain um, change, the principle behind change, in unity and diversity. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Anaximenes. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so let's let's go back. Sorry. So Anaximander was not seeking to account for change in unity and diversity through primitive matter. Um, because any matter for him, particularly water, is a material opposite, having conflict and encroachment with other material things. So Anaximander didn't think that the one unifying fundamental thing was a material thing at all, right? Um, and he didn't really take, it doesn't seem to me that Anaximander really took enough careful attention to all the elements. What he seemed to do instead is account for just how water doesn't um, suffice as this primitive matter, for it doesn't account for things that are hot and dry like fire does. Um, and so, in comparing water and fire, these two opposites, he found that they had no common property, and so these elements couldn't constitute the basic stuff of reality. Now, Anaximenes, who um, was a successor of Anaximander, well, really became the chief head of the Milesian school. Um, Anaximenes will return back to the primitive elements because air actually does account for that common property between these material opposites. But for Anaximander, not Salamander, for Anaximander, there must be some common non-elemental stuff behind the things. And he called this the the unlimited, the indeterminate boundlessness, this eternal, ageless things, stuff that encompasses all the worlds. If you know anything about, say, Taoist or Neo-Confucian philosophy, Anaximander's notion of the apeiron, this unlimited, indeterminate boundlessness, is a lot like um, uh, the great ultimate in Neo-Confucian thought, or chi, um, in Taoist and Neo-Confucian thought. But the problem with um, Anaximander's view is it's pretty it was pretty straightforward from the point of view of Anaximenes. How can it be the fundamental principle if you can't see it or experience it? It's 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 a pure idea that has no, it doesn't seem like it can be verified in any way. Now, when Parmenides comes along, Anaximander has uh, uh, some credibility if we think of being itself as, eternal and omnipotent and so on. Uh, but still, Anaximander's view of it was just kind of peculiar. Like, how can we account for the changing of things by something that is unlimited? It's not material. What are we supposed to make of that, right? Well, Anaximenes returns to primitive matter, and he notices a flaw in Anaximander's logic. Because for Anaximenes, air can be a fundamental element, at least concerning the other three elements, right? Because it can account in its properties for elemental properties in the other elements. So, like when air condenses, it gets colder and denser, and as it rarefies, it gets hotter and sparser. So there, it's accounting for water, moisture, and fire or dryness. So air is an element that makes up a continuum of properties in common with the other elements. From the coldest, most dense stuff, rocks and earth, to the cold but less dense, like snow, mud, and water, to warm air, and finally to the hottest, smoke and fire. So Anaximenes, right at the close of the Milesian school, he offers a kind of tentative solution to the question, which is to say that air is the most primary of the elements, right? But even though air is a better explanation than water or the other elements, it still cannot be verified in terms of origins, because its origins are unclear. Ask yourself this: where does air come from? That's a tough question. You say, well, meteorological patterns like produce it. It's like, well, okay, but what came first, air or the meteorological patterns? Like, what is air? What are we talking about exactly, too? Are we talking about the atmosphere composed of many different um, uh, uh, chemical compounds, right? Are we talking about something that allows for the possibility of life? You know, a question of origins is still there, and so we're still wondering uh, what really accounts for change, right? What is behind the air? It's like what is behind the wind? Where does the wind come from? Well, Miletus fell in 494 BC during the Ionian Revolt, and philosophy at this point was pretty much synonymous with the doctrine of Anaximenes, but it was circumvented in short time by the Pythagoreans, who do provide us with um, uh, uh, an abstract principle behind things, although um, not in the most fundamental way. With the fall of Miletus in 494, the Milesian school must have come to an end. The Milesian doctrines as a whole came to be known as the philosophy of Anaximenes, as though in the eyes of the ancients he was the most important representative of the school. In general, we may once more repeat that the main importance of the Ionians lies in the fact that they raised the question as to the ultimate nature of things, rather than in any particular answer which they gave to the question raised. We may also point out that they all assume the eternity of matter. The idea of an absolute beginning of this material world does not enter into their heads. Indeed, for them, this world is the only world. However, it would be incorrect to regard the Ionian cosmologists as dogmatic materialists. The distinction between matter and spirit had as yet not been conceived, and until this happened, there could hardly be materialists in our sense. They were, however, materialists in the sense that they tried to explain the origin of all things out of some material element, but they were not materialists in the sense of deliberately denying a distinction between matter and spirit, for the very good reason that the distinction had not been so clearly conceived that its formal denial was impossible. So, of course, if we were to begin thinking about material things in terms of this distinction of matter and spirit, which, as we will see, becomes the hallmark doctrine of philosophy. Um, you've probably heard it framed in different ways. The distinction of matter and spirit is not actually the substance dualism of Descartes, mind and body separation. Um, but the distinction made something like that possible because it opened up the possibility that there might be a real distinction or a true separation of the two. It, in for Aristotle in particular, though, the distinction was not a separation but a composition. And so if we start to think about this distinction, which is going to be a later development, we can appreciate, I think, in pronounced ways, what these early Milesian school philosophers were up to. I mean, think about air, for example. I mean, what comes to mind when we think of that? Well, we think of breath, right? We think of in the Hebrew ruach, right? The breath of life. And so that's an important way of thinking about. There's an important connection there to the word, right? The uh, to the animate activities of human beings, the spirit of human being, right? Which you get more after the following from the Milesian school with Heraclitus. Uh, but before we get to Heraclitus, we have to note the great achievements of the Pythagorean society, uh, specifically Pythagoras. So it's important to keep in mind first that the Pythagoreans were not merely a crowd of disciples of Pythagoras. They were members of a religious society or community which was founded by Pythagoras at Croton in South Italy. So now we're moving a little bit from the western coast of Ionia, modern day Turkey, on the Mediterranean, across to Italy. But Pythagoras himself was an Ionian, and the early members of the school spoke the dialect. So this common pre-Socratic dialect. So Pythagoras is a very interesting figure. Of course, you took a geometry course at a public school, you would know about the Pythagorean theorem. Um, but that's just uh, skims the surface of all that Pythagoras taught, um, and what he believed in, or what it's held that he believed in. He had various religious ascetic ideas. Uh, in fact, some people believe that Pythagoras was the father of vegetarianism. There was an abstention of Pythagoras and his people who belonged to his society to abstain from flesh meat. Uh, that's one, but also there are some metaphysical doctrines or metaphysical beliefs that he had in accordance with this religious ascetic um, way of life. The most commonly attributed to him, um, and it's not commonly attributed, it's well founded that he held this view, is the doctrine of the transmigration of souls, metempsychosis. This is a very tricky doctrine. Uh, there are different ways that people have uh, expressed the meaning of it. Um, some people take it to mean that uh, it's like a kind of quasi reincarnational view. When some being dies, like an animal, its soul migrates into the it emerges with being in some way, emerges into the organon of nature. Um, Others have taken it to be a kind of cyclical migration of souls, um, which I mean that's a lot like in Hindu philosophy, the samsaric cycles. Uh, uh, there are more kind of complex views to this as well. Um, the cyclical migration of souls, I mean, it has to do with the spiritual intelligences, which the philosophers held to this view. I mean, the spiritual intelligences are basically angels in a more Christian framework who are conveying and working through the universe in some way at the behest of God's will. But in this cyclical migration view of metempsychosis, the idea is that uh, the celestial bodies, are what the angels are moving, are have a determinative effect on the course of things and keep souls moving in this cosmic cycle of life and death. So, I mean, it's quite similar to the samsaric cycles of Hinduism. It just has a Pythagorean flair to it. But basically, for the Pythagoreans, uh, their contribution, and although it's kind of can be coupled with a kind of astro determinism, of souls in a kind of cyclical migration. What Saint Bonaventure refers to the consequence of it as false cycles of happiness. So you still see maybe some of the influence there with like modern astrology and what have you. Um, Although their contribution is some way kind of goes along with that, it can be stripped from it as well. And the contribution itself is that it's not basic material stuff that explains change in the world, but a rational mathematical principle, numerical harmony, right? And this principle is itself a truly unchanging principle. It can be configured in different ways, right? We can become mad with numbers and with um, sequences and harmonies and things, but it is itself a truly unchanging principle of metaphysical mathematical harmony and proportion behind the world, but then instantiated in the world of experience. For the Pythagoreans, numbers are abstract entities or objects that, while not visible in and of themselves, we don't really see the number one in and of itself, but we see the abstract entity of the one instantiated in the world of experience, right? You're looking at one person here, not many persons. Um, there is, of course, a consideration about just how what we're to make of that. Um, it seems like just stopping there can lead us to accept certain ideas and things about the world that are problematic, to say the least. I mean, would a Pythagorean view of numbers in this way, if we just take it in and of itself, whatever that view may be, uh, would it not allow for someone to begin sort of organizing their life just by the cosmic harmony of things in astrology, right? Mars is in retrograde. This is evincing the Fibonacci sequence, and et cetera, and so on and so forth, right? Um, but Aristotle, to get back to the contribution itself, right? For Aristotle, the Pythagoreans were really the first to promote the pre-Socratic doctrines, right? And having been reared on them, they supposed that the sources of them were the sources of all things. And since numbers are by nature primary among these, and in them they thought they saw many similarities to the things that are and come to be, more so than in fire, earth, or water, that such and such an attribute of numbers was justice, so and so is soul or intellect. Another one, do measure, and likewise with one might say everything. And what's more, they saw in numbers the properties and explanations of musical harmonies, since then the entire nature of the other things seemed to be after the likeness of numbers, and the numbers seemed to be the primary things in all nature. So they assumed that the elements of numbers were the elements of all things, and that the whole heaven was a harmony and a number. This comes from Aristotle's Metaphysics. Now, it's something interesting to note on this, right? That um, the sources of these elements had a numerical harmony behind them. Um, that there was something more primary than the fire, earth, or water. It's interesting to note that, say in the medical art, we have these four humors, right? The choleric, um, the the melancholic, the uh, let me remember. Hold on a second. Um, the choleric, the melancholic, the sanguine, and the phlegmatic. Each of these humors is associated with an element, right? Either fire for choleric. Um, all right, well, now I got to go back and look. Fire for choleric. Uh, Earth for melancholic. Uh, Air for sanguine, and for phlegmatic, it's water. There are these four elements attributed to each of these humors, and the humors are like basically personality structures, and they're surprisingly reliable personality structures. But what really, just from my own personal experience on this, what really initiates the awareness of the personality structure. We can identify, we can say, oh, I'm like fire, I'm like air. But what really initiates it is the spectrum of musical modes that pertain to each of those personality structures. And so the the Pythagoreans were onto something, right? They say, look, there's something more primary to to our reason than just these elements, right? Uh, and yet there's something we can attribute to it that confers harmony to our reason as it thinks in relation to these elements, and that's music, right? Uh, as an experiment, I encourage you to go and look at the different modes of music that pertain to the different personality structures, and tell me if you don't understand part of what is being said here. So for the Pythagoreans, it seemed to them that the entire nature of the things, of the elements, right, were after the likeness of numbers, right? That if you were to order numbers and numbers in space too in a certain way, which is what music is, right? It's what a time signature is. You ordering uh, numbers in space, and then you add to that sound, right? For them, that had to be it, right? That had to be what explains it. And so there are, of course, many different mathematical and geometrical models that the Pythagoreans give to us, right? Um, for for the Pythagoreans, that all things are numbers would mean that all bodies consist of points of units in space, even bodies of this or that personality, of this or that material element, fire or whatever. Um, to say that all things are numbers would mean that all bodies consist of points of units in space, which when taken together constitute a number. And there are different models that they have for for thinking through this. The tetractys, which is for them was a sacred object, right? Which just the basic point here is that 10, which is a number of which is a number of completion for the Pythagorean in the sense of forming a geometrical harmony, a triangle, an equilateral triangle. Um, the tetractys it models that the number 10 is the sum of 1, 2, 3, and 4 dispersed across space, but united in precise geometric ratios, right? So so we have one at the top, 2, 3, 4, right? But then you can further create uh, precise ratios from this, right? So on the right there is a Sierpinski triangle, and this is a kind of, if you were to take the tetractys in its formulation, and then you were to apply like a dialectical rule to it, you could just keep creating ratios within it, and you could do this infinitely. You could just keep creating ratios inside of it. And so to get the Sierpinski triangle, like dialectical rule for it is like you pick a point anywhere within the triangle or on a line, and then you put another point, and then you do it halfway between it and whatever of the 3 points. And you just keep doing that over and over, and you get this fractal. Um, but then also in the Pythagorean, with the Pythagoreans, you have, for instance, their their square sequence. Um, uh, and in a square sequence, you either get mnemonic, projection, or oblong extension, depending upon how you're adding, right, from the number one. So you start with the base of one, uh, and depending upon how you add to that, you're going to get one of two um, um, sequences, right? Either a kind of mnemonic projection, which is just evening out but expanding, like square roots. You're squaring it, or an oblong extension, rectangular, right? So numbers, right, are the organizing feature for establishing harmony of bodies in time, because bodies consist of these points of units in space. Okay, so that's a lot on the Pythagorean contribution. Um, it looks like we're gonna have to end with um, uh, end with Pythagoras uh, because we're at the time. For next lecture, we will um, look at the views of Heraclitus and then Parmenides. And at that point, we will be at the close of the pre-Socratic era, and so we'll begin our transition into the Socratics, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.